For nearly 3 decades, Evelyn Harper had walked the same hallways, clocked in at the same loading dock, and carried the same worn leather binder filled with her meticulously organized notes. She wasn't just an employee at Medicine Pharmaceuticals, she was part of its DNA. Starting as a warehouse assistant at 29, she had risen through the ranks with quiet diligence. No fanfare, no shortcuts. She had weathered mergers, a recession, a warehouse fire, and 2 major restructurings. At 58, she didn't move with the same speed as before, but there was a quiet authority in her steps. People nodded to her in respect. Younger staff often called her Ms. Evelyn out of admiration, even though she always insisted on just Evelyn. Her locker had a photo of her grandson, Ethan, and a post-it that read, "Just 3 days to go." 3 days, that's all that stood between her and the retirement she'd earned. On her 65th birthday, Evelyn would be fully vested in Medicine's defined benefit pension plan, one of the last of its kind. She had done the math. With her modest lifestyle, the payout would be enough to buy a small lake cottage in Minnesota, where she dreamed of gardening, drinking tea at dawn, and writing letters to her grandchildren. It was a dream that had kept her going through long winters and harder years. Then came Friday. It was a little after 9:00 a.m. when she received the calendar invite. Urgent executive briefing, 9:30 a.m., conference room B. It was unusual but not alarming. She tucked her binder under her arm and made her way to the room, smiling as she passed by her colleagues. She opened the door to find Damian Cross, the new CEO, already seated at the polished glass table. 2 HR representatives flanked him, their faces tight with discomfort. "Evelyn," Damian said without rising, "thanks for coming, please have a seat." She sat slowly, eyes narrowing. Damian got straight to the point. "Effective immediately, your position has been eliminated as part of a strategic restructuring initiative." It took a second for the words to register. "We are moving toward automation," he continued. "The warehouse and logistics division is being consolidated under a third-party vendor. Your role, unfortunately, is considered redundant." The HR woman to his left added, "You will receive a severance package, and we are offering outplacement services to assist with this transition." Transition, the word thudded in her ears. She sat still, her binder still resting on her lap. "There must be some mistake," she said quietly. "I'm 3 days away from retirement, my pension." "Your official retirement date is not until Tuesday," Damien cut in smoothly. "Unfortunately, your termination takes effect today." Her pulse pounded in her ears. She glanced between the three of them. There was no remorse, no hesitation, just sanitized corporate efficiency. "You knew," she said slowly, her voice shaking. "You waited until the last possible moment so you wouldn't have to pay out my pension." "We followed all legal procedures," the HR woman said, her tone clinical. Evelyn stood without another word. She didn't want to cry in front of them, she wouldn't give them that. Back at her locker, she packed slowly. Her coworkers hadn't heard yet. She managed a tight smile when someone asked if she was okay. She said she had a meeting, no one pressed. She removed the post-it with the countdown, her hands trembled. By noon, she was walking out the door she had entered nearly 30 years ago. The sunlight felt different, colder somehow. She sat in her car in silence, staring at the steering wheel. Then slowly, she reached into her purse and pulled out an old business card, slightly faded, the edges soft with time. Richard Lansing, founder, Medicine Pharmaceuticals. She had worked beside him when he still wore rolled-up sleeves and insisted on joining the night shift during flu season. He had once told her over coffee in the break room, "Evelyn, I don't care if the lawyers say it's not binding. I put my name on that pension plan because people like you deserve security." She dialed the number on the card, even though she knew he had retired years ago. The number was disconnected. But she remembered another name. Julia Lansing, his daughter. She had met her at the company anniversary gala 10 years ago, a whip-smart lawyer, sharp eyes, firm handshake. She remembered Julia's business card had a New York address. Evelyn opened her laptop and began searching. Her fingers trembled as she typed. 3 days, that's all they had taken from her, but she still had something they didn't expect. Memory, loyalty, and a story worth telling. Evelyn sat at her kitchen table well past midnight, the glow of her laptop the only light in the room. Her modest home in suburban Illinois was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of old floorboards. She had been searching for hours, combing through legal articles, company records, and archived news stories. Her fingers were sore from typing, her eyes burning from strain, but she was relentless. It wasn't just about her pension anymore. It was about decency, about people like Damian Cross thinking they could discard those who had built the company just to pad a quarterly earnings report. Evelyn had seen the signs long before she was let go, younger hires being pushed forward without experience, management reshuffling under the guise of modernization, and whispers of automation contracts with overseas vendors. But she had always believed her loyalty would matter. She finally found Julia Lansing's profile on the website of a Manhattan law firm, Lansing and Crowley LLP, senior partner, corporate governance and labor protections. The firm specialized in employment law, especially pension security cases. Evelyn hesitated for a moment before composing the email. She introduced herself formally, reminded Julia of their brief meeting, and included an attached letter she had written recounting every detail of her dismissal. She pressed send, then she sat in the stillness of her kitchen, staring at the screen until the inbox icon blinked. New message. It was from Julia. Subject: let's talk immediately. The following morning, Evelyn found herself in a Zoom call with Julia Lansing, who looked every bit the sharp and decisive woman she remembered, even sharper now in a pinstripe suit, her dark hair pulled back into a no-nonsense bun. Julia wasted no time. Evelyn, what they did to you is not only unethical, it may very well be illegal. That pension plan was part of a grandfathered benefits clause tied directly to your employment start date and tenure. If they dismissed you 3 days before vesting and did so without proper cause, there's a case here. A strong one. Evelyn felt a flicker of hope, but she tempered it. Even if it was wrong, they have high-priced lawyers. I can't fight that. Julia smiled faintly. You don't have to, I can. Within days, things moved faster than Evelyn could have imagined. Julia filed a formal grievance with the Department of Labor and sent a letter of intent to sue to Medicine's legal department. But it wasn't just about Evelyn. Julia had suspected that other longtime employees had faced similar quiet terminations near their vesting dates, and she began compiling a list of names with Evelyn's help. The story caught the eye of a journalist at a national financial publication. With Evelyn's permission, they ran a feature titled The 3-Day Firing: How Medicine Saved Millions by Robbing Retirees. The story went viral. Phone calls started pouring in. Former employees, many of them in their 50s and 60s, shared eerily similar stories. Some had been let go a week before vesting. Others had their roles reclassified just in time to void their pension eligibility. The pattern was unmistakable. Damian Cross, it seemed, had turned a cost-cutting strategy into a quiet policy of weeding out veteran employees. A class action suit began to take shape. Meanwhile, inside Medicine's headquarters, chaos reigned. The story had rattled investors and board members alike. Internal documents were subpoenaed. Employees began whispering in corridors, and HR staff were instructed to maintain silence. Damian Cross, once the company's young visionary, now found himself dodging reporters and being grilled by the board. Evelyn didn't relish the attention, but she understood the necessity of it. She gave careful, dignified interviews. She spoke not just of her own story, but of the culture that had let this happen. She never raised her voice, but her words carried weight. A week after the story broke, she received a call, not from a lawyer, not from a reporter, but from someone she hadn't heard from in years: Anthony Beckman. He had started at Medicine the year before Evelyn and had retired 5 years earlier. He was one of the last to get out with full benefits. Ev, he said, his voice warm, you're doing what I wish I had the guts to do. They tried to push me out too, but I was just stubborn enough to hold on. I kept every paper, every memo. If you need anything, I mean anything, you let me know. He emailed her scanned copies of memos from the old guard, internal benefit newsletters, and even a company-wide recording of Richard Lansing promising lifetime benefits to senior staff at the 2002 retreat. All of it, Evelyn passed to Julia. The case swelled. A week later, Evelyn was approached again. This time, it was a reporter from a major cable news network. They wanted to do a segment. She said yes. In the interview, Evelyn wore a soft blue blouse, her silver hair pinned back. She sat in her garden with her bird feeder in the background. I didn't set out to take down a company, she said. I just wanted what I was promised, what I earned. But if my story helps others find their voice, then maybe it was worth it. The anchor looked genuinely moved. You seem so calm despite everything. Evelyn smiled gently. You learn a lot when you spend your life listening. People always tell you who they are. Eventually, if you're patient enough, the truth speaks louder than the lies. Back at Medicine, the board met in private. The optics were untenable. The lawsuit, the press, the drop in stock price, all traced back to one decision: firing a woman 3 days before her pension vested. The board voted to place Damian Cross on indefinite leave pending investigation. It wasn't a full victory yet, but it was momentum. And Evelyn knew how to hold steady. She'd done it all her life. That night, she sat back at her kitchen table, sipping tea. The war wasn't over, but the first battle had been won. And all it had taken was one quiet woman with a binder full of memories, the right email, and the courage to make a phone call. The third week after Evelyn's story went public, the ripples had become waves crashing across Medicine's polished image. But the shock hadn't yet settled into justice, and Evelyn knew better than to celebrate too soon. She had spent her whole life watching how power insulated itself, how the right words from the right lawyers could wash away guilt like chalk on a rainy sidewalk. Yet something had changed. This time there were eyes on them, and Evelyn was no longer alone. Julia Lansing's legal team had expanded their investigation and uncovered internal emails that revealed troubling details. Among them was a directive from Damian Cross himself, instructing middle managers to assess tenure risk in the lead up to each fiscal quarter. The phrase sounded innocuous, but its meaning was crystal clear: get rid of those whose pension liabilities were about to mature. In one email, a VP asked, "Do we have a list of employees hitting pension thresholds in Q4?" It was cold, clinical, but it was evidence. When Evelyn was shown the documents during a video call with Julia, her hands trembled, not out of fear, but out of something deeper. Anguish, maybe, that her decades of dedication had been reduced to a highlighted row on a cost-saving spreadsheet, but Julia, ever the tactician, stayed calm. "This is corporate sabotage," she said. "You weren't let go for performance, you were eliminated as a line item." Medicine's board, now backed into a corner, began scrambling. They issued a public statement acknowledging an unfortunate oversight and offering private settlements to several other former employees. But Julia advised Evelyn to reject theirs. "They want to sweep you under the rug with a check and an NDA. You deserve more than money, you deserve accountability." So Evelyn held her line. She continued attending legal strategy sessions, reviewing evidence, and giving controlled, powerful interviews. Her story had become a rallying cry for older workers across the country who feared what awaited them as retirement loomed: betrayal in a tailored suit. One evening, as Evelyn watered her backyard tomatoes, a local delivery truck stopped in front of her home. The driver, a woman in her early 40s, hesitated before stepping out. She handed Evelyn a small parcel and said, "You probably don't remember me. I worked nights in logistics back in 2009. You trained me on that ancient inventory software." Evelyn smiled, genuinely surprised. "Of course I remember you. You always brought donuts when it was your turn for shift snacks." The woman laughed, then grew solemn. "I just wanted to say thank you. Watching what you're doing, it gives me hope for all of us." Inside the box was a hand-drawn card from the driver's 10-year-old daughter. It showed a woman with silver hair standing in front of a building labeled Big Bosses, holding a sign that read Fairness. Evelyn kept it on her fridge. Meanwhile, the class action lawsuit advanced. Depositions were taken. Internal compliance officers began leaking documents anonymously. Julia's firm filed a motion to subpoena Medicine's internal audit reports for the last 10 years. The pressure was mounting. But the most surprising blow came from within Medicine itself. A quiet, introverted data analyst named Carlos Menendez stepped forward. He had spent years working under the radar in the HR analytics department. One afternoon, he emailed Julia directly from a burner account stating, "I have access to data that proves the targeting was systemic. I've kept my own archive. You'll find timestamps and manipulation logs, but I'll only share if you guarantee my protection." Julia arranged for Carlos to speak under whistleblower immunity. What he delivered was explosive. An internal algorithm Medicine used to flag employees based on tenure, age, salary, and benefit costs. The algorithm had been nicknamed internally as a gray line. It was not just unethical, it was discriminatory. Evelyn was stunned. "I was a calculation," she said aloud one night to herself, sitting by her living room window. "Not a person, not even a name." But then she reminded herself, she was now more than that. She had become the reason the lie had a spotlight, and if they thought her age or silence would protect them, they had badly miscalculated. At the next media briefing, Julia laid it bare. With Carlos's data, testimonies from former managers, and the leaked emails, the lawsuit transformed from a wrongful termination case into a full-scale federal labor violation investigation. Under growing scrutiny, Medicine's largest institutional investors began to pull back. Pension funds and retirement trusts that held Medicine stock demanded immediate governance changes. The company's share price dipped another 11% in 2 days. And finally, the call came. Damian Cross was officially removed as CEO. No announcement, no ceremony, just a line in the corporate filing that noted, "Effective immediately, Mr. Cross has stepped down to pursue other opportunities." Evelyn read the headline without fanfare. Then she made herself a cup of chamomile tea and sat on her porch, letting the steam rise into the cool evening air. She didn't smile, but there was a deep calm in her bones, a quiet exhale. Later that week, she got a letter in the mail, a handwritten note. It read, "To Ms. Evelyn Harper. Your courage gave voice to what many of us feared but couldn't prove. Because of you, I kept going. Because of you, I remembered we matter. Janine, age 62, former Medicine R&D team." She tucked the note into the same binder she'd carried for 3 decades. 3 days, they had tried to take away her life's worth for the sake of a number on a quarterly report. Now Evelyn was the one doing the counting. And the world was watching. By the time fall arrived, Evelyn Harper's name had become synonymous with the fight for ethical treatment of aging employees across the country. What began as one woman's quiet stand against corporate betrayal had become a national conversation. But for Evelyn, the real work was just beginning. Vindication was powerful, yes, but justice was unfinished. The class action suit had been filed, the former CEO had been forced out, and multiple investigations were underway. One morning, a letter arrived by certified mail. She recognized the Medicynth logo before she opened it and braced herself. The letter, cold and bureaucratic, informed her that the company was offering a revised settlement package, one that included her pension payout but required a full release of any future claims and an agreement to cease public commentary. Evelyn folded the paper neatly and set it aside. Later, she emailed Julia the contents. "They're still trying to buy their way out," Evelyn wrote. Julia replied, "And silence you in the process. We'll reject it, but the offer itself is a sign they're losing ground." Evelyn knew that meant a new phase was coming, one that would require strength of a different kind, not just perseverance but patience, because the wheels of justice turned slowly, especially when they had to roll uphill against powerful corporate interests. Still, Evelyn showed up to every legal prep call, reviewed every document, and stayed engaged, and slowly momentum shifted further. The Department of Labor began formal inquiries. Several senators facing re-election used Evelyn's case as a platform to advocate for stricter pension protection laws. A House subcommittee on labor requested her testimony. Evelyn was stunned. She wasn't used to politics, but Julia assured her this was important. "You don't need to be a politician," she told her. "You just need to be Evelyn Harper." The hearing was scheduled in Washington, D.C. It was her first time flying in over 15 years. As she sat by the plane window, Evelyn looked out over the patchwork of fields and towns below and thought about all the people she'd met over the last months, former coworkers, truck drivers, journalists, lawyers. All of them had told her the same thing: "You reminded me that we matter." She arrived at the Capitol in a navy blue pantsuit her daughter had helped her pick out. Julia walked beside her, calm and composed, and together they stepped into the hearing room. It was larger and more intimidating than she expected: wood-paneled walls, microphones lined along a polished dais, cameras positioned like eyes. When it was her turn, Evelyn adjusted the mic with a trembling hand, then she spoke. "My name is Evelyn Harper. I worked at Medicynth Pharmaceuticals for 29 years. 3 days before I would have been fully vested in my pension, I was terminated without cause." She continued, telling her story with clarity and heart. She spoke not only of her own experience but of Carlos Menendez's algorithm data, the spreadsheet with her name highlighted, and the silent fear that gripped every older employee she had known. "We're not liabilities, we're people. We gave our lives to these companies. We deserve better." By the end of her statement, the room was silent. Even the committee chair, a man known for being gruff and impatient, leaned forward and thanked her personally. The next morning, Evelyn's face appeared on national news again, this time not as a victim, but as a witness for change. The coverage included clips from her testimony, paired with commentary from labor experts. Medicynth, meanwhile, released another statement insisting they were reviewing internal policies and committed to ethical conduct. But Julia wasn't satisfied. "We're not after PR spin," she said. "We're after accountability. Let's press harder." So they did. A formal motion for summary judgment was filed, citing clear evidence of intentional pension suppression. With mounting evidence and growing public pressure, the presiding judge scheduled a full hearing. Evelyn returned home to find a stack of letters waiting for her. Some were handwritten, others typed. Many came from strangers. "Dear Ms. Harper," one read, "I'm 64 and scared every day that I'll be next. You make me feel seen." Another, "I lost my pension in 2012 and have been afraid to speak out. Thank you for doing what I couldn't." And one, from a 26-year-old woman working her first job, "I hope when I'm your age I have even half your strength." Evelyn cried quietly that night, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming truth that her story was no longer just hers. It belonged to every person who'd ever been overlooked, silenced, or discarded. The following week, Julia received a phone call from Medicynth's legal team. This time, they weren't offering a settlement. They were requesting mediation, privately. "It's a signal," Julia said. "They want out, but this time we set the terms." Evelyn agreed. The mediation was held in Chicago in a quiet office building with frosted glass doors and soft leather chairs. Evelyn sat across from Medicynth's new interim CEO and their attorneys. No Damian Cross, of course. He had faded from the public eye. The meeting was long, tense, and at times absurd. "We're prepared to offer a lump sum pension payout with interest, full back pay from the termination date, and a public acknowledgement of procedural failure," one attorney said. Evelyn looked at Julia, then back at the room. "That's not enough." "What more could you possibly want?" the attorney asked, exasperated. "I want a guarantee," Evelyn said slowly, "that no one else will go through what I did." The room fell quiet. Eventually, Medicynth agreed to a series of internal reforms: independent oversight on pension management, mandatory age bias training for all executives, and the reinstatement of pension protections for employees with over 20 years of service. Evelyn's personal terms were also met, including her full pension, back pay, and an official apology signed by the board. She left the building not with triumph but with peace. Later that month, she stood at the edge of a quiet Minnesota lake, keys in hand to the small cottage she had dreamed of. The autumn leaves swirled in red and gold around her feet. Her grandson Ethan ran up beside her with a paper sailboat, laughing. "Grandma, let's race it across the water." Evelyn knelt beside him and smiled. "Let's do it together." She had earned this peace, not just for herself, but for the hundreds who had walked the same path and the thousands who still would. 3 days, that was all they tried to take from her. But she took back everything they never expected she would. In the quiet months that followed her victory, Evelyn Harper settled into a life she never thought she would live. Peace was not something she had known in a long time, not the kind that soaked into the bones, that greeted her in the rustle of pine trees or the stillness of morning tea on the porch. The cottage by the lake was exactly as she imagined, though more modest than what others might have expected after winning a high-profile lawsuit. That was fine by her. Evelyn didn't care about appearances. Though she was no longer at the center of the media storm, the echoes of her fight rippled far beyond her quiet life. Her story had become a case study in labor law courses. Nonprofits reached out asking if she would speak to groups of displaced workers. A small documentary crew even asked to visit her lake home for an interview series on whistleblowers. She declined most offers, not out of bitterness, but because she felt her work was already done. She had nothing to prove. Still, there were days she felt the weight of all she had endured. A morning breeze would catch the corner of her old leather binder, and she'd be transported back to the cold, fluorescent-lit conference room where she had been dismissed. Sometimes she'd catch a news clip about corporate downsizing and feel her jaw tighten. Trauma leaves traces even when justice is served. One evening in early spring, she received an email from Julia Lansing. Subject: something you should know. Julia wrote that Medicine's board had followed through on their internal reforms, but that whispers of retaliation were surfacing. Some employees who had privately supported Evelyn's case were allegedly being sidelined or quietly pushed out. Though it wasn't illegal per se, it was deeply unethical. Julia wanted Evelyn to consider making a public statement to reinforce her support for those still inside the company. Evelyn stared at the screen, conflicted. She had fought her battle. Did she owe it to others to keep fighting? She thought about Carlos Menendez, the data analyst who had risked his job and future by sharing evidence. She thought about the delivery driver with the hand-drawn card, about the older woman who said she finally felt seen. And then she thought about herself, who she had been a year ago, sitting in her car outside Medicynth, clutching a faded business card, unsure what to do. The answer was obvious. She called Julia the next morning. "Tell them I'm not done yet." Together, they organized a follow-up op-ed in a major national newspaper. Evelyn wrote every word herself. In it, she called on Medicynth and other corporations to protect those who stood up for ethics. She reminded readers that whistleblowers were not traitors, they were the last line of defense when systems failed. "Retaliation doesn't undo the truth," she wrote. "It only makes the silence louder, and we've had enough silence." The op-ed sparked new conversations. 1 week later, a coalition of senior executives at other companies released a statement pledging to review their own pension policies. Evelyn's name was cited again and again as the catalyst. Around this time, she received a handwritten letter forwarded through Julia's office. It was from Carlos. "Dear Evelyn, after I spoke out, I was afraid, but watching you never flinch gave me strength. I resigned from Medicynth last month, not out of fear, but because I wanted to build something better. I'm launching a nonprofit to help employees fight back against corporate abuse, and I'd be honored if you joined the advisory board. Warmly, Carlos Menendez." Evelyn was touched. She called Carlos that evening. He sounded younger than she remembered, energized and hopeful. She agreed to help, not as a leader, she didn't want that spotlight again, but as a quiet mentor, someone to offer wisdom when the storm swirled. And so, a new chapter began. Evelyn joined monthly calls with Carlos and his growing team, advising on how to identify corporate patterns, how to document misconduct, and how to stay grounded through public backlash. Her perspective wasn't legal, it was lived. Months passed, summer arrived, and Evelyn spent more time in her garden. Tomatoes, squash, and basil thrived in the sun. Ethan visited often, now taller and chattier, telling her about school projects and asking endless questions about that time Grandma fought the big company. "It was," she said, brushing a curl from his forehead, "but sometimes the right thing is scarier than the wrong one." Ethan thought about that, then nodded, as if filing it away for some future day when he'd need courage of his own. Then one day in late August, the phone rang. It was Julia again. Her tone was unusually soft. "There's been a development," she said. Damian Cross is trying to launch a new company, a startup, tech-based. He's pitching it to investors as a workforce optimization platform. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. You mean another way to algorithmically fire people? Julia sighed, possibly, and here's the twist, he's using fake names in the filings, but we traced it back. It's him. We're planning to release a statement to warn potential partners, but I thought you should know. Evelyn felt a deep, cold ache settle in her chest. Not fear, not even anger, just the weary recognition that some people never learn. Some people keep reinventing themselves not to grow, but to escape accountability. I don't want revenge, she said slowly, but I want the truth to follow him wherever he goes. Julia nodded, that's exactly what we'll do. A joint statement was issued, signed by multiple advocates, labor attorneys, and whistleblowers. Evelyn's name was the last one on the list, not bolded, not at the top, just present like the quiet voice in a storm that refuses to be silenced. In the weeks that followed, investor interest in Cross's venture dried up. News outlets covered the story. His reputation, already damaged, became toxic. Evelyn didn't celebrate. She planted more bulbs in her garden and kept attending Carlos's meetings, but she allowed herself one moment of reflection. She stood by the lake, the wind in her silver hair, and whispered, 3 days, that's what they thought I was worth. And yet here she was, still shaping the future, still holding the line. Because sometimes justice wasn't a court ruling or a payout. Sometimes justice was a life reclaimed and a legacy that couldn't be erased. Autumn returned with its amber gold splendor, painting the trees around Evelyn Harper's cottage in brilliant reds and oranges. The lake mirrored the changing leaves, quiet and steady, much like the life she had cultivated in the aftermath of everything. The world had begun to move on, as it always did, but Evelyn remained a symbol, a gentle reminder of what perseverance, principle, and dignity could look like in the face of betrayal. She didn't seek out attention anymore, she didn't have to. People found their way to her by letter, by email, by quiet word of mouth. Former employees, union organizers, labor law students, and even corporate whistleblowers from other industries reached out to her, sometimes just to say thank you, sometimes to ask, what should I do now? She never gave them answers, only questions. What does your conscience say? What would you want your child to remember about your decision? One chilly afternoon in mid-October, Evelyn hosted a small gathering at her cottage. It wasn't anything formal, just a handful of people she had grown close to through the long fight. Julia Lansing, Carlos Menendez, a retired warehouse colleague named Marvin, and even Janine from the R&D team who had sent her a letter months before. They brought food, sat on the porch, and shared quiet laughter while Ethan played with Carlos's son down by the water. Over roasted squash and mulled cider, the conversation turned reflective. You know, Marvin said, scratching his salt and pepper beard, I still can't believe it all started with you making a phone call. Evelyn smiled faintly. It started with them making a mistake. They thought I'd go quietly. They always do, Janine added. They count on silence, but what happens when someone finally decides not to be quiet? Carlos raised his glass, then a movement begins. They toasted softly, solemnly, not to victory but to resilience. Later that evening, after everyone had gone and the dishes had been washed, Evelyn sat alone with a journal in her lap. She had started writing again, not for publication, but for herself, for her memories. For Ethan someday, the journal wasn't a list of events or facts, it was feelings, moments, names. She wrote about the fear she'd felt walking out of medicine that day, the disbelief, the cold. And then she wrote about the fire. The way it sparked the moment she realized she had something they couldn't control, the truth. Her phone buzzed gently beside her, a new email. She opened it and read. Subject, Evelyn, you inspired our bill. Dear Ms. Harper, thanks to your testimony and continued advocacy, I'm proud to inform you that our proposed legislation, the Pension Protection and Employee Fairness Act, has just passed the state legislature with bipartisan support. Your story was referenced more than once on the floor. The law will ensure companies cannot terminate employees within 90 days of vesting without just cause and external review. Thank you for being the catalyst. Warmly, Senator Laura Green. Evelyn put the phone down slowly, her breath caught, not in pain, not in anger, but in quiet, profound disbelief, the kind that accompanies real change, the kind that takes root in the bones. She stood and walked out to the porch. The stars were beginning to emerge above the lake, scattered across the darkening sky like stories yet to be told. She wrapped her cardigan tighter around her shoulders and breathed in the cold air, crisp with wood smoke and fallen leaves. 3 days. That's all they tried to take from her. But they hadn't just failed, they had unwittingly unleashed a woman who had spent nearly 3 decades building quiet strength. And when they pushed her out, they made room for her voice to finally rise. In the weeks that followed, Evelyn was invited to speak at a town hall in her home state. The event wasn't televised. There were no flashing cameras, just a modest crowd of people, mostly workers in their 50s and 60s, some retired, some still hanging on. She stood before them in a simple sweater and slacks, her silver hair glowing under the warm light. "I'm not here to talk about what was taken from me," she began. "I'm here to talk about what we must protect, our integrity, our stories, and each other." She shared not just her experience, but what she'd learned about systems, yes, but also about fear, about courage, about the terrifying but beautiful moment when you realize your silence will cost you more than speaking ever could. After her talk, a man in the back stood up. He looked to be about 70, weathered from decades on the job site. "I waited too long to speak out," he said. "Do you think it's too late for me?" Evelyn didn't hesitate. "It's never too late to stand up for yourself," she said. "The first step is remembering that you deserve to." He nodded and a few others clapped, not loudly but meaningfully, enough to shake the dust off a room that had grown too used to being quiet. When she left the building that night, Evelyn didn't look back. She didn't need to. She knew where she'd been and she knew where she was going. Back at the lake, the seasons shifted again. Snow would come soon. Ethan was due to visit for the holidays, and Evelyn was already planning a new project, a collection of short essays she would leave behind for her grandson, not about pensions or lawsuits, but about choices, about being kind and brave and honest when the world gave you every reason not to be. In the end, Evelyn Harper's story wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about justice. It was about remembrance. That when they thought she was finished, she was only just beginning. That when they tried to erase her, she wrote herself back in. And that even a whisper, when held with conviction, can thunder loud enough to change the world.